I'm Victoria, your girl with no selfie, and in today's video we're going to be discussing Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So this video is going to be a slight book review, more of a summary, but most importantly I'm going to have a bit of modern commentary to it. So as we progress along the story, I'll tell you my 2 cents about what I think. So Pride and Prejudice was set in the 1800s and we're in 2018 and I'm a modern gal, so I'm going to be giving my opinion on that while still staying true and sticking to the original, or what I believe is the original intention of this story. So let's start. Pride and Prejudice is set in the 1800s in the small town of Meryton. And there's a bit of dilemma with the Bennet family. So Mr. Bennet has 5 daughters, and the reality is, unless one of his daughters marry well, there's no one who's going to be able to take care of the family when he dies. So essentially, one of the girls needs to find a rich husband, get married quick to ensure the family's well-being after his death. With that said, in those times, property could only be inherited by a male heir. He has no son. So then it would pass on to a cousin, who in this case would be Mr. Collins. If this was 2018, he could have just adjusted his will. Women can own property today. It would have passed on to his wife, worst case scenario, and the family would be fine. But hey, it's the 1800s, it's old school. So with that in mind, Mrs. Bennet is obsessed, super obsessed with marrying her daughters off. I mean, let's face facts. This woman does not want to step down in life and in society, so she's super obsessed. Okay, so let's talk about the girls of the Bennet family. So there are 5. I made notes. So there's Jane, who's 22, who is an extremely beautiful woman, who is sweet, kind, caring, loving, just everything. But the problem with Jane is she tends to see the world through rose-colored eyes. Then there's Elizabeth, who is 20. Now she's the book's protagonist, but in my opinion, she is the hero of this whole story. And she's clever, witty, lively, and everything. And to a great deal, she's sensible, but she does make hasty judgments, which you will find out in the book. And then there is Mary, 19. She thinks she's a smart one, but she's not at all sensible. Kitty, who's 17. She's just as empty-headed as her mom. And lastly, there's Lydia, 16, who is ill-mannered, silly. She's absolutely rebellious, ridiculous, but more importantly, and you need to remember this one, she's the man-crazy one. So there is Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Those are the 5 Bennet children. So, of the 5, Jane and Elizabeth want to marry for love. Unfortunately, their situation does not afford them that luxury, because the reality is, like I mentioned earlier, one of them has to marry well in order to secure the family's future. Now, a 2018 take is, you know what? We can point fingers all we want, but that still happens today, where there's some families who insist that their offspring marry well, not just to attain wealth for themselves and by extension their family, but it's also to keep wealth and status in the family. So that too is also very important. Okay, so fast forward a bit now. Jane meets a gentleman, Mr. Bingley, at an event, and immediately, she approves of him, she likes him, she loves him, but her sisters disapprove. They're like, no, you can do better, yada, yada, yada. So Elizabeth meets a Mr. Darcy, and he is an extremely wealthy man, very well-to-do. In her family's eyes, that would be a perfect match. And Darcy, despite, Elizabeth's lack of connections and wealth, he finds her attractive too. But Elizabeth can't stand him. She thinks he's a snob, he's arrogant, she wants nothing to do with him. Then, like things don't get, any more interesting, an offer of marriage was given to Elizabeth by their cousin, Mr. Collins. Now note, if Elizabeth's father dies, Mr. Bennet, he is the one who would stand to inherit the estate. Now, Elizabeth wants nothing to do with Mr. Collins, and she refuses his proposal. Her mother is furious because at this point, her mom's thinking she's silly and he's going to inherit the estate anyway. So why not marry him? Her dad, on the other hand, Mr. Bennet, was relieved. He was happy Elizabeth didn't decide to marry Mr. Collins, but Mr. Collins is set on leaving with a wife. So he proposes to Elizabeth's friend Charlotte instead, and she accepts. Oh boy. Okay, so here's my take on everything that just transpired. The reality is, if family and friends don't approve of, some unions, it's not going to work out. So I completely understand what happened with Jane and Mr. Bingley. They thought she could do better. They didn't approve. So that relationship died, poof. But let us talk about Mr. Collins for a bit. Like, how thirsty is this man? I mean, first things first, I understand Elizabeth's mom being upset at her refusal, because at the end of the day, the mom just wants their life to be fine and well. And don't get me wrong, I don't like the mother, and you'll find out later on in further discussion, but she just wants the estate to remain in the family. So she was extremely disappointed. But backtrack to Mr. Collins. Again, this man is so thirsty. So Elizabeth refuses his proposal. What does he do? He goes right away and asks her friend. Like, what the hell? You could have waited until the next visit. At least that's what I think. But anyway, let's talk about Charlotte. I'm quite disappointed in Charlotte because, you know what? She's a sensible girl. But the reality is, and then I'm trying to look at it from her point of view, Charlotte's older, older than the other girls. And in a way, she sacrificed love for for a secure future. At least she knows she would be guaranteed a comfortable life. So, she sacrificed love in this instance. But honestly, if it were 2018, she would have seen the thirst. She would have been like, to the left. Where's Queen Bee when you need her? But anyway, so that's the situation with, the trickling of the relationships from Jane and Bingley, Elizabeth and Darcy, and she just pushes him to the side. Then Mr. Collins comes in the picture, and now Charlotte. So now, a regiment of soldiers comes to town. Now, Kitty and Lydia, who are the younger sisters of the five, they're so excited. They're happy at the new prospect of men in town. And again, remember, Lydia is the giddy-headed one. Now, Elizabeth meets a Mr. Wickham, and she is quite interested in him. I would say she fancied him. And then she hears a story from Wickham, how Darcy cheated him out of, good fortune and money and inheritance. So immediately Elizabeth's just like, ugh, the nerve of that guy. So let's analyze that. First impressions are lasting, and Elizabeth already had a bad taste about Darcy in her mouth. She thought he was a snob, arrogant, yada, yada, yada. Now to hear this story from Wickham, it just further confirmed her beliefs. I mean, how many times have we refused friendships and relationships with individuals because of things we heard? I mean, at this point, I can't blame Elizabeth. I completely understand. So Elizabeth has been spending quite a bit of time with Mr. Darcy, and despite everything, the more time Mr. Darcy spends with Elizabeth, he really likes her. So he proposes to her, and she refuses angrily. First, she blames him for Jane and Mr. Bingley not working out. And then she also blames him for disadvantaging Mr. Wickham. I'm just like, whoa, Elizabeth, speak your mind. I was just, you go, girl, you go. So fast forward. Later on, Darcy gives Elizabeth a letter, essentially explaining everything, saying, this is the situation with Wickham. I never meant to hurt Jane, yada, yada, yada. And he explains everything in detail. And that was kind of like a whoa moment for Elizabeth, and she realizes she made hasty judgment. I mean, personally, I was like, oh boy, what is a girl to do? You know, all the signs were pointing in this direction. You know, she made her decision on that. Now she's realizing, whoops, I might have been a bit too quick to have judged him. But you know what? It happens. We all make mistakes. I don't hold Elizabeth to it. It's just that right now she knows better. She's more informed. So in real life, in 2018, remember to fact check. So here's a twist in the book, which in a way kind of made it a bit more interesting for me. So wild child, man crazy, Lydia runs off with Mr. Wickham. Shocker. You know, there goes the wild child running off, you know, not caring about anyone else and what it will do to the family, to elope. I'm not even going to talk about that, but what I will say is Elizabeth confides in Mr. Darcy about the embarrassment, you know, essentially that's going to cause on the family and all of that. And I was just like, oh. So now, with all this embarrassing news with Lydia about town, Elizabeth's uncle and aunt seek out Lydia. So they're looking for her, then they find her and they find Wickham, and they found out Wickham had no intentions of marrying Lydia, which between you and I already knew he was not an honorable man, like from the get-go. So I was just like, whatever. But they somehow persuade Wickham to marry Lydia by giving him a deal he can't refuse, and the deal is done. So in real life, money and connections have been getting families, out of trouble for centuries. This is nothing new. We see this happening today in 2018, but see, it was obvious this was happening way back in the 1800s, and I'm sure it was happening even before then, because that was, you know, essentially what had persuaded Wickham to marry Lydia, and the family, all they're trying to do is save their good name. Money and connections, people. Money and connections. So then, Elizabeth, you know, the girl I'm rooting for, she does some investigating on her own, and she realizes that it wasn't her aunt and uncle who had secured the deal with Wickham to marry Lydia. It was actually Mr. Darcy. I was just like, oh, sheds tear. Okay, I know I'm being really dramatic, but to me, that was like the sweetest thing ever. You know, it proved, you know, his feelings for her were genuine, and he would go above and beyond, not just for her, but to help, you know, her sister and her family. And then Bingley returns and marries Jane. Now, who says love doesn't win? Boom. Okay, so like there couldn't be any more drama, right? So word of Mr. Darcy's intention to marry Elizabeth reaches Lady Catherine, who is Mr. Darcy's aunt. Now, she is not having it. So she shows up, she meets Elizabeth, and all she's been doing is insulting her and just going on and on. And then she makes Elizabeth promise, or actually tries to make Elizabeth promise that she's going to refuse Mr. Darcy's proposal when he asked her the second time, you know. And she was like, nope. And I was just like, yes, you go, Elizabeth, because this woman is acting like, oh, my daughter's better suited for this union and yada, yada, yada. But I mean, how can you not love Elizabeth? You know, here's this girl in the 1800s standing her ground, not being bullied by this aunt who is obsessed with marrying her daughter off to Mr. Darcy. You go, Elizabeth, you go, girl. So Darcy was actually quite pleased with, you know, Elizabeth and how she handled his Aunt Catherine and just, you know, essentially pushed that to the side. And he proposes to her again. And this time she accepts. And, you know, she assures her family that, you know, I actually really do love this man and she's not marrying for money. And you know what? I believe her, and I know that to be true too. And it was just, you know what? It was just amazing how everything had kind of worked out. And Elizabeth realized that, you know what? She made hasty judgment about Mr. Darcy and that he is a good and honorable man. And now this is my opinion on reflecting on this whole thing. I mean, am I the only one who thinks that Mr. Darcy was a man ahead of his time? So here's the thing. Darcy could have married any woman he wanted, you know? And I'm not knocking Elizabeth, but she's not the easiest woman to be with, you know? She's very headstrong. She's firm, you know? And for that time, one, it's not common, and it's also not desirable in a wife. Elizabeth as well, she could have settled with her first proposal, you know, when Mr. Collins came around, but she didn't. So, you know, these two individuals, I kind of felt like for that time, they were way ahead. And in today's day and age, you know, they would probably be seen as a power couple. Okay, so my last words on Pride and Prejudice is, you know, there were numerous themes in this book. Upbringing was a major theme. Then there's a complex and tricky business of marriage, you know, and just people getting together at that time. Another theme in this book was wealth and social standing, and you know, its importance back then, and I can definitely say it has great bearing on the world today. So personally, I enjoyed Pride and Prejudice. I enjoyed my look into England in the 1800s. It's definitely different from the England I know today. But yeah, so I enjoyed Pride and Prejudice. I would definitely recommend it as a classic to be read for sure. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed my classical commentary and my quick and short review on Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to link below the transcript of this classical commentary, which you can find directly on my blog. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.